Evening, everybody. So, there we go. I wonder what you think of when I mention modern slavery. You know, maybe when you talk about slavery, your mind goes to kind of biblical stories like Joseph sold into slavery by his brothers, you know, working in Potiphar's household, or maybe it's a bit more modern than that. It's the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade. You know, slaves enduring horrific conditions, extreme overcrowding, you know, hundreds shackled together in cramped quarters below deck. And those are the images that slavery conjures to mind when you think of ages past. But as Richard has already said, sadly, we need to talk about modern slavery as well. It's a crime that is hidden, but it's a crime that happens across the world and in every community. And so tonight we're going to talk about what that looks like in the UK, what CARE are doing about it, and what you can do about it. So I'll start with a story of Annalisa, a Filipino woman. She got a job as a household maid for a family with 8 children working in Qatar. It's when the family came to the UK that things got particularly dark. As she arrived on British soil, her employer took her passport from her. They took her to the house where she would work as a domestic maid, and they made her work from 5 a.m. until 1 a.m. every day. That's 20 hours a day, working 4 hours to sleep. But even that was sleeping on the floor of the nursery, so she would be woken up by the children she cared for. She wasn't given food, so she had to scavenge and steal food from within the household, and she was paid less than £1 an hour. She was beaten and abused. She had no passport. She had no way of proving who she was. She did not know any of her rights. She did not know how to get help, and so she stayed out of fear. So often with modern slavery, it's not chains that bind someone, but fear or control or abuse or threats. Eventually, she happened to meet another family who helped her to escape, but just so she could work for them instead. Now, the conditions were slightly better. Crucially, they allowed her to go to church. And it was through attending a local Filipino church that she came across an organization that worked with victims of modern slavery. Amazingly, there were lots of people in that church working for that organization. They recognized the situation that she was in. They got her out, set her free, provided her with a place to stay, got the police involved, and now Annalisa is free and she works tirelessly for that organization, paid to make sure that she can help others in similar situations. See, Annalisa's story happens every day in countries poor and rich. A professor of contemporary slavery at Nottingham University has said this: slavery is not a horror safely confined to the past. It continues to exist throughout the world, even in developed countries. Across the world, slaves work and sweat and build and suffer. So this is our theme tonight, and in case it wasn't obvious, we are going to cover harrowing material. But while it will be harrowing, I also want to strike a note that will be hopeful, because we do have a God who sees, we have a God who knows, a God who cares, and a God who works to set people free. So here's the roadmap. We'll explore what is it, what is modern slavery. That will include a quiz. Then what does God say about modern slavery? Look at some Bible passages, some Bible principles, and then what can we do about it? And then at the end, after the break and after the Q&A, I'll point you to some further resources, and we'll have a short time maybe when we can pray. But let's begin by asking, what is modern slavery? And I'm going to give you 3 crimes that are connected but different. And it's really important to make sure we know what we're talking about. So first up, modern slavery itself. That is the exploitation of people for personal or commercial gain by the use of force, fraud, coercion, or deception. All sorts of ways that can happen. We'll come back to that. But what it boils down to is treating people as commodities, as human beings, as objects to be exploited. Now, a subset of modern slavery then is human trafficking. Human trafficking involves the movement of people for exploitation by the use of force, fraud, coercion, or deception. So it's very similar to modern slavery, except now you are moving people around. And it doesn't have to be far. You could have a British teenage girl from one end of Trowbridge. You could move her to the other end of Trowbridge for the purpose of exploitation, and that would be human trafficking. So modern slavery and human trafficking, very similar. The only minor distinction is human trafficking involves moving the person. And then the third crime is people smuggling. So people smuggling involves assisting migrants to enter a country illegally for financial or material gain. And it's important to see the distinction here. People smuggling involves crossing borders. Now, sometimes if you're human trafficking someone, you're going to move them across a border. That includes people smuggling. But another time, you might do some people smuggling that involves no exploitation at all. There may be no coercion, force, or fraud. They pay you some money. They want you to take them across the border. You do it. So people smuggling may occur with modern slavery and human trafficking. It may be something completely different. And the reason it's important to make that distinction is because in debates around modern slavery, even at the highest level with some politicians, it can get caught up with people's views on immigration. And those can be very strongly held. And what can sometimes happen is those terms can be used interchangeably. If there's one thing you remember from tonight, at Care, one of the things we're always pointing out is that whatever someone's immigration status, to exploit an individual for profit through force, fraud, coercion, or deception, to enslave them, is always a heinous crime. So tonight we're going to focus on the human trafficking and modern slavery side, whether or not it involves crossing a border. But before we do that, we'll just try and get a scale of the problem. We'll have this short quiz, 7 questions, and we're just going to do it by a show of hands, ABC each time, and the winner can get a sense of satisfaction for themselves. So what we'll do, I'll just read out the answers, and then you can read out the questions, and you can put up a hand for A, B, or C. So question 1, how much does the modern slavery industry make per year? Is it 1.2 billion, 12 billion, or 120 billion pounds? So anyone for A? Anyone for B? Anyone for C? So most of you are correct. Now next up, with that, the only kind of illegal industry that makes more is the drug trade. Next up, how many slaves are there worldwide today? Is it 4 million, 40 million, or 400 million? So let's go for A, B, or C. So this time it was B, 40 million. That's the highest number of slaves, and higher than any number of any time in human history. The highest number is now. And it's just so important to remember that, okay, well, that's a stat, and we guessed right or wrong, but 40 million, behind that stat are human beings. Every single one of them with a story, with a life, with hopes and dreams that have been snatched away. That's worldwide. Then in the UK, let's say 17,000, 55,000, 122,000. A, B, C. Fairly even split. I think most went for B. This is actually a trick question. There's 2 answers. So 17,000 according to the National Referral Mechanism. That's the government's framework for identifying and helping potential victims. But that is probably a wild underestimate because it's not an estimate. It's actual numbers of people who have been referred and doesn't count all the people who have not yet been found. So an independent charity came up with a figure of 122,000 last year in the UK. So the national referral mechanism, then, that's the government's system for tracking those who have been referred as potential victims of modern slavery. What would be the most common nationality referred under the NRM? So we've got Albanian, British, or Vietnamese. Let's go Albanian, British, Vietnamese. So mostly Vietnamese. Well, those were the top three. The highest number is British, with 26%. Albanian and Vietnamese both second with 13% each. So those three comprise over half of the victims. But again, that just shows modern slavery. It's not always about immigration. It's about exploitation, and that can happen to people from any nation. Next one, are there more men or women referred to the NRM? Is it more men or women, or about the same? So A, B, C. Yeah, this one surprised me as well. I think only a couple of people put their hands up, but A, it's men. Although 73% of the people referred are men, although for victims of sex exploitation, it's about 99% women. Almost there. Question 6. What percent of those crossing the channel in small boats claim to be victims of modern slavery? So should we go A, 4%, B, 9%, C, 18%? Roughly even there. The answer's in the middle. 9% of people crossing the channel claim to be victims of modern slavery, and almost all of them, 4/5 of them, were confirmed by the government. Yes, we do agree, you do seem to be such victims. And lastly, last question, how many convictions under the Modern Slavery Act were there in 2021? So we can go for 33, 233, or 433. A, B, or C? Yeah, depressingly, most of you were right. Just 33 convictions. That confirms this is seen as a low-risk, high-reward crime for those who want to get involved in it. I hope that's helpful just for kind of getting an idea of the scale of the problem. But what we'll do now is we'll zoom in a little bit and think about what that, we took modern slavery, exploitation, what does that look like in practice on the ground? So there's a few different forms of it. One is debt bondage. It's where there's a power imbalance because you owe money and that's the means by which you're exploited. It's Proverbs 22:7 in action. Proverbs 22:7 says, "The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is the slave of the lender." Takes it to an extreme. So let me tell you the story of Ferda. Ferda was in his 60s, living on the streets in the Czech Republic. He had no income, he lost touch with his children, struggling with depression, and someone came and befriended him on the streets and offered him somewhere to live and offered him a job in the UK. And he was delighted by that. And when he arrived in the UK, he was told he had to pay back the traffickers for the travel. They told him he had to work more than 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and he had to pay almost all of the money he earned back to the traffickers as they demanded ever-increasing amounts of money because of the interest rates to repay his debts and for the accommodation they were providing him. And he had no documents, nowhere to go, no one to turn to. His health got worse and worse and worse, and finally, when it was bad enough that he could no longer work, the traffickers cast him out onto the streets because they figured they couldn't squeeze any more money out of him. One of the biggest areas of growth for modern slavery at the moment is in the care home sector. We have a shortage of carers in this country, so the government has various visa programs to encourage people to apply from abroad. And you don't have to pay for that, but what overseas gangs will do is they will charge £20,000 to sort your visa and flights. And then once you're here, they will entrap you and make until you have paid back every single penny. It's a form of modern slavery, debt bondage. Next up is very similar. It's labor exploitation. Literally forcing someone to perform compulsory labor for very low or zero pay. And this can happen in all sorts of places. Often car washes, nail salons, domestic servitude. People are forced to work, they don't get paid, or they get paid an absolutely pittance of an amount. Any money they do get is taken by the gangs that control them. And they're threatened. They say, if you do or say anything, we'll track you down, we'll punish you. And if they're not from the UK, they're taught to fear. If you report anything, you'll be deported. The police will arrest you. They're not on your side. Labor exploitation. And then the third form of modern slavery is sexual exploitation. And I won't go into graphic detail on this, but this is simply abominable, where people's bodies are used by the traffickers for their personal profit. A quote from one woman said, sorry, I'm just looking for the words. I was working 7 days a week like an animal, no phone, no ID. I didn't even know which part of the UK I was in. And this isn't just in the big cities, this is in every community. Last September, Wiltshire Police raided 8 properties in Swindon. 18 victims of sexual exploitation were rescued, and they're being supported by the police and a local modern slavery charity. At CARE, we do lots of work on sexual exploitation, on campaigning for law change in that area. I've just scraped the surface there. There are so many stories of so many ways that people are exploited and enslaved today. Evil finds new ways to rear its head, ever more creative as it looks to make money out of people. And it can leave you, and it has left me, discouraged and disheartened, because as I've already said, behind every statistic, behind every number are human beings like you and me, made in the image of God. And sometimes it is too much to bear. But I want to just shift gears at this point. We can talk more about that in Q&A if you want, but just to bring God into the picture and to bring some hope, because God sees and God knows and God has a better story for victims of modern slavery. Sometimes you hear criticism of the Bible, don't you, that God has nothing to say about slavery or God endorses slavery. I think as we look at the Bible for the next few minutes, we're going to see how much God cares about freedom and liberation. And what we'll do, we're doing a tour of the Bible for the next 10 minutes. It's going to start on the first page and finish on the last page. And just as we go through, we're going to learn a few things about God and his character and see some individuals who God worked through and some lives that were changed. So we can start on the first page. In Genesis chapter 1, we have the creation of Adam and Eve. And when God makes them, he breaks into poetry and into song, and he proclaims this amazing truth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So every human is made in the image of God. Not just Adam and Eve, but even after the fall, even great sinners. Every one of us, you, me, everyone, made in his image. And every human has an inherent dignity and value simply for being made in God's image. Whoever you are and whatever you've done, no matter how rich or poor you are, no matter whether you are slave or free. So one of the things about modern slavery is that it dehumanizes people. It doesn't treat them as individuals, made in the image of God, loved by God. It treats people as property, as products. People are created not for purchase or to be property, but for a purpose, which is to know God and to be loved by him. So that's Genesis 1. Let's pick up the story in the book of Exodus. As it begins, we find not just an isolated case of an individual who's a slave, but a people trapped in slavery. In Exodus chapter 1, they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. They ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. description of just how ruthless it is. But then at the end of the second chapter, what we read is that the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery. They cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery, this is beautiful, it came up to God. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. I think it's beautiful, God hearing the cries of the enslaved. Today, the cries of people in modern slavery do not fall on deaf ears. They might have had their passport taken away. They might have had to work 18 hours every day. They might not get paid for that work. They might be unable to communicate with people outside, with their families. Their families might think they're dead. But God hears their cries. But even then, it's not simple. In Exodus, God sends a rescuer, Moses, with his brother, but initially things get worse. They met Moses and Aaron, who were waiting for them as they came out from Pharaoh, and they said to Moses and Aaron, "The Lord look on you and judge, because you've made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." See, because Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh, it resulted in their burdens being increased. And that captures some of the fear of people in modern-day slavery today. They fear it will get worse if someone tries to help. They fear recriminations. They fear further abuse. That's why some of the advice about modern slavery is that if you think someone might be, if you think you see a situation where there might be someone being exploited, enslaved, it's not always the best thing to go up and confront it head on. We'll talk a little bit later about what you can do and who you can call. But there is often great fear attached to slavery. But then the story, of course, continues. God liberates his people. And just one more character to mention from Exodus, Pharaoh's daughter. She's pretty amazing. A woman with great privilege, born into a powerful family, but who heard the cry of a slave, or a baby boy of the enslaved people floating on the river, and she chose not to turn a blind eye. Under God's sovereignty then, her action set off a chain reaction that led to the freeing of the people. Let's jump ahead to Psalms next. There's a long list of Psalms that speak into modern slavery, but we're just going to look at Psalm 10. Begins, "Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" Captures the frustration that God does not seem to do more to intervene and end this scourge of modern slavery. And the whole psalm seems to speak into modern slavery. But listen to this, particularly describing the enslaver. It says, "He sits in ambush in the villages, in hiding places. He murders the innocent. His eyes stealthily watch for the helpless. He lurks in ambush like a lion in a thicket. He lurks that he may seize the poor. He seizes the poor, which he draws into his net. And the helpless are crushed and sink down and fall by his might. He says in his heart, God has forgotten. He has hidden his face. He will never see it." We bank on that not being true, don't we? God has not forgotten. Jump ahead to verse 13. "Why does the wicked renounce God and say in his heart, 'You will not call to account'? But," here's the good news, you do see. For you note mischief and vexation, that you may take it into your hands. To you the helpless commits himself. You have been the helper of the fatherless. Break the arm of the wicked and the evildoer. Call his wickedness to account till you find none." Sometimes Christians struggle with these imprecatory psalms, they're called, psalms that call for judgment and violence. I tell you what, the more time I spend thinking about modern slavery, the less I struggle with it. Psalm finishes, "The Lord is king forever. The nations perish from his land. O Lord, you hear the desire of the afflicted. You will strengthen their heart. You will incline your ear to do justice to the fatherless and the oppressed, so that the man who is of the earth may strike terror no more. It's a reminder that God will act on modern slavery. We long he would do it faster. We don't understand his timescales, but the time comes when God arises, takes action, and when he does, woe to those who are oppressing and enslaving those who are made in his image. Briefly, two more Old Testament verses. We've got Isaiah 58, God rebuking people for their false displays of religiosity and saying, this is what I want to see instead. Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. God's people, I want to see you engage with breaking the chains. And finally, in the Old Testament, remember this is our tour from beginning to end of the Bible, Proverbs 31. I believe I preached on this passage when I was here last year. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. So those in modern slavery are often those with no voice. Sometimes that's because they don't speak the same language as anyone around them, or maybe it's because of fear that they're afraid to use their voice. But God doesn't put it on the voiceless to find their own voice, but for us to speak up, to open our mouths for them. God cares about the slave, and he shows that by calling on those who are not slaves to use their voices. Jump ahead to Jesus. We mentioned this verse briefly this morning in Nazareth when he talks about proclaiming liberty to the captives, set at liberty those who are oppressed. Jesus so often talks about bringing freedom. He didn't abolish slavery right away. In fact, he gets criticism for that, but I think he did something far more powerful. He sowed the seeds that would undermine slavery, not just once at that time in history, but undermine it throughout history, so that whenever slavery reared its ugly head again, it would be overcome by the church. And how did Jesus undermine it? By affirming the brotherhood and sisterhood of all people. By building a kingdom where you love your neighbor as yourself. A kingdom that would spread across the whole world. When you love your neighbor, you can't enslave them. By dying on the cross, he affirmed the equality of all people. There is neither slave nor free. And in the rest of the New Testament, we see that start to play out. Acts 16, Paul and Silas set a slave girl free. 1 Timothy 1, Paul writes to Timothy, he lists enslaving people as a sin. Book of Philemon is a story of a slave named Onesimus who ran from his master, yet comes to faith and returns to Philemon one day, not as a slave, but as a brother. I love verse 3 of the Christmas song, O Holy Night. Truly he taught us to love one another. His law is love and his gospel is peace. Chains shall he break, for the slave is our brother, and in his name all oppression shall cease. Now, the church has many blemishes in its history, but it is also the church throughout the ages that has led the way in fighting slavery, from the first centuries all the way to Wilberforce, all the way to today. And just to finish this Bible tour, let's see what God says about modern slavery with a couple of verses from Revelation. Chapter 18 is about the fall of Babylon, the end of Babylon's economic oppression, and it says, the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, and I'll skip ahead a little bit towards the end, and incense and myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and slaves. That is human souls. The final judgment against systems of exploitations, the final judgment against those who enslave, including the reminder again that every slave is a human soul. And then on the final page of the Bible, slavery will be no more. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death shall be no more, neither shall be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. So that's the Bible story, start to finish, and it is a story of people being liberated. Individuals, sometimes whole nations, sometimes one at a time, and that's still being played out today as people are being set free and finding hope. So yes, modern slavery is bleak, and it's happening all over the world and here in our communities, but God sees, God knows, and God has shown again and again that he acts. So that's where we're going so far. We've kind of looked at what is it? What does God say about it? In this third section, I want to think what we can do about it. It's really easy to feel overwhelmed when you start exploring the reality of modern slavery, of people who are trapped in fear, whether that is working their 18-hour days or being locked in a room waiting for men to come and do their business with them again and again, unable to contact their families or anything else. It's easy just to be overwhelmed by the scale and horror of it, but there is so much good that is happening. Modern slavery is a really complex crime. It's hard to fight, and you need people approaching it from every angle. So what you need is charities on the ground supporting victims of modern slavery. A small charity near my home in Surrey called Their Voice, doing an incredible work. Victims arrive at safe houses and they've got nothing except the clothes on their back. Their Voice is there to provide clothing, provide care packages, toiletries, counselling, all sorts of things. It's just a small charity in one part of the country. But there are much larger charities. There are national charities and international charities. I'm really impressed by the work of International Justice Mission. They work across the world with law enforcement, rescuing victims of modern slavery, helping to bring the perpetrators to justice. Modern slavery needs to be fought at every level, both at the bottom level, but also at the top. It's at the government level that the slave trade was abolished in 1807. It was the government that passed laws banning slavery itself in 1833. Before then, you didn't need to have this hidden crime of slavery. Slavery was legal. Now we have modern slavery hidden behind closed doors. It's because it is illegal. To tackle modern slavery, therefore, you need modern laws. And this is the level that CARE engages at. So as a charity, we've been going for 40 years. We started working on modern slavery in 2006, and that was before my time. But if you were to ask people who have been at CARE across the decades, they would say our biggest success in 40 years has been on the topic of modern slavery. It's back in 2012, there was a chance conversation that led to amazing things. Makes me think of the book of Esther, where minor coincidences change the course of history. There's a member of the House of Lords and of the Northern Ireland Assembly called Lord Morrow, and he just kind of said in a throwaway remark to a member of staff at CARE, well, when are we going to do something about modern slavery? And we took that question seriously. We said, well, Lord Morrow, you could introduce a bill to deal with human trafficking, a new bill for modern slavery. We'll write it for you. We'll advise you on it. We'll help you take it through the Northern Ireland Assembly. So that process took about 3 years. The Human Trafficking and Exploitation Act became law in 2015. It was literally written in CARE's offices by CARE staff. I'll tell you what we achieved in a minute, but here's what's exciting. That then became the template for modern slavery bills elsewhere. Parts of it were copied word for word for a modern slavery bill in Scotland, and then for a modern slavery bill in Westminster that covered England and Wales. Republic of Ireland then did the same, and you even have politicians from Lithuania phoning up Lord Morrow and saying, we want your advice on modern slavery. Laws can seem really distant and far off, but they actually make a difference. And this is some of what this Modern Slavery Act 2015 did. It introduces harsher penalties for trafficking, including up to life imprisonment. It redefined slavery and exploitation with better definitions that covered the way it happens in the modern world. It provides support and protection for victims. You see, when the police bust into that home in Swindon where those women were being sexually exploited, that's not the end of the story for them. They then need a pathway to recovery. They need support. Otherwise, they won't get healing and they won't have anything around them. And in fact, there's a good chance they'll fall back into some form of exploitation. So that the Act says there should be access to support services, legal assistance, anonymity in court proceedings, so on. There's the appointment of an independent anti-slavery commissioner who oversees everything to do with modern slavery, holds the government to account. The laws we pass do make a difference. And I think it's a great Christian witness that this happened. Just as generations ago, it was Christians who led the fight against slavery. I mean, many others were involved in this, but it was a Christian politician who championed this legislation. It was a Christian charity advising, supporting, writing the legislation, and then Christians throughout the UK praying and writing letters and emails and supporting the work financially. And through that, change came. Reminds me of a Don Carson quote. It can be easy to get discouraged, especially when you've got a robust doctrine of sin and the fall, but what are we actually going to change? But Carson says this. He says, sometimes a disease can be knocked out. Sometimes sex traffic can be considerably reduced. Sometimes slavery can be abolished in a region. Sometimes more equitable laws can foster justice and reduce compassion. In these and countless other ways, cultural change is possible. That's the wrong slide. There you go. Sorry. Change is possible. So, according to the Walk Free Global Slavery Index, it ranks every country in the world according to 141 different categories to see how well they're doing at fighting modern slavery at government level. At the moment, of all the countries in the world, top of the pile is the UK. And that's something, by God's grace, to be proud of. That's the good. There's so much more to be done, and in the last 5 years, we've taken more steps back than forward. That was all 2015. Modern slavery since has gone off the political agenda. The independent anti-slavery commissioner, that job was vacant for 18 months, and when they finally got around to appointing someone, the budget was slashed. It's taking longer and longer for people to get the support they need. On average, it's 58 days before an individual gets any formal support from the government. That's a long time when you have no housing, no money, nothing. The law in England is still a little bit limited on victim support. In Northern Ireland, they guaranteed 12 months support. In England, that was watered down just to 30 days support. So to quote Jenny, who was on the slide earlier, Jenny, a sex trafficking victim who has been rescued, said, "I'm learning how to live normally. One of the biggest challenges has been believing that I deserve a happy future. 18 months on from my escape, it's slowly getting easier. I now wake up feeling free, and I appreciate that more than anyone can imagine." But that's after 18 months. The law in England at the moment, they're only guaranteed 30 days support. You don't get to that place in 30 days. On top of that, with a lot of the politics around migration in the last 3 or 4 years and the Rwanda bill, many of the modern slavery protections were watered down. And that's why we started by saying it's not primarily about immigration. And when politicians get the two confused, modern slavery victims get forgotten. Genuine victims of modern slavery are less likely to come forward when the protections they need are removed. We've got a new government now. We're monitoring their actions and their words to make sure that modern slavery is a priority for them. See, there's so much to be done, but it's a fight that doesn't seem to end. And yes, the last few years have seen more steps backwards than forwards after the highs of 2015. So much done, so much more to be done. But what about you? What about the everyday decisions that you might make? Well, I've got 4 things you can do. Number 1, it's so important that you pray. You know that. Pray as a church, pray as individuals. Ask God to give you a heart for the imprisoned, for those who are in slavery. Ask God to show you what you can do. Number 2, and this is massive, be alert. Spot the signs of modern slavery. This is something we can all do. You can Google signs of modern slavery. You'll get a comprehensive list, but here are some of them. If you see someone who works excessively long and or unusual hours with no breaks, who is transported to and from work, who is fearful, anxious, nervous, avoiding eye contact, seems to have poor physical health, maybe malnourishment, has no personal possessions, who's not allowed to speak for themselves, they seem maybe to be disorientated, have no real sense of time or place or where they are or when they are. They can all be signs that someone might be in a situation where they're being exploited or controlled. Tell you a story about someone who worked for Care. She walked past the same nail salon each day, and she used to look in, and the staff just always looked away whenever she looked in the front door, and she just got this feeling that something was a little bit off. She could have ignored that feeling and just gone on with her day, but she phoned the modern slavery hotline. And that was it. That's all she needed to do. She just gave the details of it, and they said, okay, well, we'll look into it. They investigated, and it turns out that in that nail salon, yes, there were victims of modern slavery who had been trafficked to this country and were being forced to work. In those situations, it's really easy to dismiss it, to think, oh, maybe I'm overthinking it. But it can change someone's life if you just flag up a report. You could think maybe, oh, okay, that's fine in the big cities, but we're in a rural community here. Rural areas can offer attractive prospects to potential criminal exploiters. In the seasonal industries with high demand for short-term seasonal labor. Remote locations where criminal operations can be hidden away from the public eye. It's hard to monitor large and sparsely populated areas. The Police and Crime Commissioner for Wiltshire said recently, the reality is the police cannot tackle this alone. You can help us by being our eyes and ears and reporting information that doesn't feel right or where you feel exploitation is happening. Together we can stop exploitation. It's okay to be wrong about a report. Your job is just to flag something if it looks suspicious. I'll put the number for the modern slavery hotline on the screen in a bit. If you regularly use car washes, there's hand car washes you get, download the Safer Car Washes app. An app that basically enables you to log your experience of a manual car wash so that they can then spot patterns and identify where victims of modern slavery might be being forced to work for little or no pay. So be alert. Number 3, be an ethical consumer. I mentioned earlier that the UK is the best in the world at dealing with modern slavery. I want to caveat that now, in a sense. We're the best in the world in terms of our laws. But modern slavery and forced labor are connected to demand as well as supply. And we are a rich country. It is often on the backs of consumers in rich countries that you have supply chains that lead back to people in modern slavery in far-off lands. And in our global society, modern-day supply chains are incredibly complex with so many layers, it can be really difficult to know if the clothing I'm wearing or the coffee I'm drinking or the electronics I'm using have been produced with forced labor. It is really difficult, and it is really frustrating because so much is so opaque, and sometimes the research you need to do feels like a full-time job. But I think what we need to do is say, look, where I can, I am going to choose to get products ethically. There are companies out there who are specifically working against modern slavery. You can order from them Manumit coffee. Manumit literally means, it comes from the word manumission. It literally means to set free from slavery. Their coffee is roasted by men and women who have suffered exploitation but are now rebuilding their lives. If you have a coffee in 10 minutes' time, you will be drinking coffee roasted by those who have been set free from modern slavery. But maybe if there's a store you use regularly, Google them. Look at their modern slavery policy. Any clothing manufacturer that has over £36 million of turnover in a year has to publish a statement on what they're doing to tackle modern slavery. Have a look at it. It's going to be impossible to get everything right on our consuming choices, but we can at least try. And number 4, very simply, be politically engaged. Christians historically are really good at writing to their MPs on issues surrounding sex and death. Moral issues, assisted suicide, abortion, gay marriage, whatever. And those are important issues that Christians hold strong views on, but we've just seen God holds strong views on slavery and exploitation as well. So one really practical thing you can do is write to your local MP to say, this is really important to me. Maybe can you raise a question in Parliament? Came across Proverbs 22, verse 11 this week. He who loves purity of heart and whose speech is gracious will have the king for a friend. What a verse to encourage writing to your local MP. The king in the Old Testament, he was the government. Today, who's the government? It's the MPs. He whose speech is gracious will have the MP as a friend. I've got a new MP where I am. We've just switched from Conservative to Lib Dem for the first time in our constituents' history. I agree with our new MP on many things. I disagree on others, but I write to him letters full of grace and truth. Mostly so far, they've been letters of encouragement. I'm sure there will be days for challenge in the future. He may listen to me, he may not, but this proverb gives me hope that if my speech is gracious with him, I'll get a hearing. So write to your MP, tell him that this is something that you care about and that you want to see the government do more on. So that's the what can I do about modern slavery? I think we're about a good time for a break. I know there's so much more I could have said, and I'm sure you've all got loads of questions. So Rich is going to tell you what to do with those questions.